So, Nathan, what's going on with boys and reading?
How long have you got? Well, nothing new, actually. In terms of a pattern, to me, it's nothing new. I went through a similar sort of experience regarding reading or lack of reading. By the time I hit 12 or 13, I didn't read outside of the class. Loved it at primary school. Loved anything creative at primary school, actually. Um, but there was a shift when I went up to high school. Now, looking at an individual perspective, I went to an all boys school and, heavily dominated by sport. It's about kind of establishing yourself as a young teenage male in quite a boisterous environment. And there was certain expectations, whether they were spoken or unspoken, about what it meant to be a man. And I guess with reading, there's a risk that it comes across as being perhaps maybe feminine, or maybe taking yourself too seriously, maybe too studious, maybe too academic, and that perhaps for me was probably the bulk of the reason, really, as to why I tailed off from reading and focused more on sport. I didn't know how much it would have benefited me. If I did, I'd like to think that I would have read, but nobody really made it a priority for me, and I guess I didn't make it a priority for myself.
Yeah, but you had that before high school. You said.
Yeah, I kind of look back and I wouldn't say I was a bookworm, but I read books. I enjoyed books. I remember reading things like Goosebumps and stuff like that.
This
So
is the skeleton one. Yeah.
well, I loved Phantom of the Auditorium. It was,
Right.
and yeah, I guess it wasn't really. I treated it with apathy. I don't think I took it seriously enough. I don't think I saw it as a legitimate part of my life. And yeah, I guess there's lots of reasons for that. So when we say what's going on with the boys and reading, I don't think it's a new phenomenon that suddenly boys aren't reading, and girls actually. I know we're talking about boys specifically more today, but I go to lots and lots of schools, lots and lots of high schools, and as soon as you hit in year 8, maybe year 9, depending on the school and the area, the scales tip dramatically.
It kind of fits with puberty,
Yeah,
and that all of a sudden you're going through your teenage years. That reading and maybe even just in general school work starts to diminish for especially boys. But yeah, you're right, girls as well.
yeah, I think that's a really interesting point because everything becomes so important at that point in our lives, doesn't it? Every moment, every word that somebody says, every thought that somebody has about us matters drastically, especially our peer group. We're pulling away naturally from our family in order to try and establish ourselves as independent, and there's a lot riding on that. We think so hard about everything, the way we look, the way we speak, what we do, what we don't do, and I feel like reading is probably one of the sacrifices or the collateral, along with many things actually, but taking things seriously, trying
Yeah.
trying at some stuff, that becomes
Well,
less and less, doesn't
there's
it?
there's something in there about the fear of failure, but also the kind of thought that if I try or I try and do well academically, that's a bit geeky.
Yeah, yeah.
And I remember thinking that when I was at school, but that was around long before I was at school, and it's still around now.
Yeah.
And that's pretty tough because if you are someone who really enjoys kind of books or education when you're in those younger years, eventually you get to high school and you think, I kind of need to be with the cool kids. That's what a lot of young boys go through, definitely.
Yeah, and it's ironic that often it's people who would benefit drastically from reading regularly. I'm including myself in that. I dismissed reading. That, I don't know, I'm not doing that, as though I didn't need it. And I was a working class teenage boy growing up in a town like Blackpool. I'm exactly the kind of person that needs reading. And I think when you speak to, when I go out and speak to young men and say it almost really candidly, like, how can you think you don't need reading? I don't think they've got an answer.
No.
There is an element of, right, yeah, actually, why have I kind of been duped into this belief? And it's the same with lots of issues, isn't it, at that age? But reading's one of them that seems to be really, really consistent across the board. You know, you have a very small minority of young people in a high school that will consistently read for pleasure, and the vast majority will almost proudly admit that they don't read. And you know, I guess there's lots of societal factors that might be we might be able to attribute that to. Maybe there's an element of kind of generational self-worth, aspiration, maybe, that, you know, when you're in a working class town, you kind of have to just get by and get a job and feed your kids, and this kind of really functional role that you've got to play in society, and almost subconsciously limiting ourselves. So to read and to take time to better ourselves and maybe push beyond initial aspirations, well, maybe that might be seen as being futile, or maybe we're not worth it. And actually, there's a strong kind of belief amongst certain people. I don't know if you've read a book called The Lost Boys.
I've heard about it, actually. Yeah,
Alex, I'll put it on the screen. He talks about the damage that can be caused by constantly telling young men that you need to raise your aspirations in such an unequal society. To just blindly instruct young men to raise their aspirations can actually be quite damaging, because we're potentially pushing them to a place where it might be counterproductive. And as it stands at the minute, there's not enough room for everybody at the top. The system doesn't allow for it.
So true.
So maybe there's a lot of these unspoken kind of subliminal messages that exist within our society, not just in school but beyond, that reading is one of those things that's, you know, if you're in a certain situation, that's optional, and if your social standing in a high school depends on it, whether you're accepted or not by your peers, you're not going to read.
So something I used to say, and I've heard loads of kids, teenagers say, is reading's not my thing. Like, it's not for me.
Yeah.
Like it's some kind of hobby. Like football, you know, football's not for me.
Yeah.
I don't play football. All right, that's fine. But when it's reading, that's something that you have to do as a human, really, to get a job, to function in life. Reading is so important for that.
It's certainly restrictive if you can't. Yeah.
Definitely. But that reading for pleasure, that is something that isn't easy. And it's because, do you not think it's because the spectrum of book genres, books that are available, you've got fiction, non-fiction, you know, thrillers, comedy, rom-coms, whatever it is, the spectrum of books is so big, it almost puts people off. A bit like when you have too many choices, you don't make a choice at all.
Yeah, fair. I mean, and you know, I guess it's worth saying that reading's not going to be for everyone. You know, you think about it's really challenging to read if your brain works a certain way. You know, if you can't retain information, you know, you think about neurodivergence, it's particularly hard for some forms of neurodivergence to retain information whilst reading. So it becomes a chore then to read, and it's not pleasurable at all. So it is worth saying that, you know, it isn't for everyone. But I do think there's plenty of people who say it's not for me without really understanding just how beneficial it can be outside of the classroom. Reading for me is framed as being a school thing from a very early age for many, and then it becomes an English thing. So it's not even like a school thing. By the time you get to high school, it's an English thing. And there's lots of schools out there doing lots of initiatives and trying to find ways of encouraging reading, or certainly bringing it into the school week. So you'll have, you know, different kind of sessions where teachers might read to young people, or then everybody might just read quietly. Like some schools have a literacy canon where it's like a half an hour, and as a class they read a book. You know, you have class novels. So there is schemes and there's initiatives, but sometimes I feel like they're coming at a time where maybe, you know, a course has already been set and the ship's maybe sailing. It's out the dock and it's off, and there's an issue around the relationship between reading and punishment. You know, I think that's probably an attachment that gets made for many, that if I don't read, I'll get punished. And then when they get old enough that the punishment doesn't really matter, then they just stop reading.
Yeah.
So they'll read at Because they don't want to miss the break time. And then when they get to high school and that's not a thing, then they won't read because they're not going to miss the break. So there's something, and I'm not saying that's to be critical of that kind of reading punishment relationship. I'm just saying it could be one of many factors as to why young people go, actually, no, reading's not for me. I've kind of served my time at primary and now I'm kind of letting go of it. Not finding a book that you enjoy, people not actively reading in front of them. So a great thing, I think, is when teachers read, when the children are reading. I think that's great. Yeah. Reading at home.
Read their own book.
Yeah, they read their own book. They bring their own book in and they read. Reading at home. So I've made a conscious decision now. I used to read in bed. And my kids know I read because there's books all over the house. Obviously, they know what I do for a job. And it does help because I find that my kids ask to read. But they're only young still. So, I imagine that they're going to get to 12 or 13 and tell me where to go if I tell them to read. But I bring books down now. And now, instead of flicking Sky Sports News on if I've got 15 minutes, I've started reading a chapter of a book.
Yeah, that's amazing.
I've started to try and do that downstairs. Because, for me, sometimes, reading a chapter of a book is way better than getting stressed out about the sports news or the political news or whatever. But also as a visual reminder that picking up a book and just reading just for the sake of it is a good thing. It can be relaxing. But it can also be really positive in terms of our vocabulary, our ideas, our levels of empathy, problem solving. So having visual role models, books readily available that are appropriate and interesting. But still, you might have all of that stuff and there might be someone who just says, do you know what, reading's not for me. I've got a mate who can't read because he gets a headache. He gets a headache when he reads. Like literally read half a page of a book and just start getting a really strong headache.
I bet there's a book that exists on how to get rid of headaches.
Possibly. So this isn't, our conversation when we say what's happening with the boys and reading. This is not it's not a one size fits all. It's not a silver bullet that fixes the problem. It's a complex, nuanced issue across society. But when I talk to young men in schools that I visit, particularly those who have disengaged with education, who just think, no, it's not for me. And there is that element of taking back control of the situation. If I reject reading, if I reject, doing well at school, I'm in control of that. Mm-hmm. If I try and I still don't get it right, I'm not in control. So when I talk to young men, it's about kind of reframing what reading is. It's not something you have to do. It's not something that just exists in schools. It's a life thing. It's a choice. It's an opportunity. And in a life that potentially might be full of challenges, disadvantages, reading's a readily available, readily accessible advantage that we can really, really benefit from. We talk about emotional regulation, we talk about kind of self-awareness, awareness of other people's perspectives. That can all be drawn from reading different books, and, they don't have to be academic books. These are, fantasy books or kind of thrillers, like you say, or coming-of-age novels. Books where they can see themselves in there, which is a big, big pull. If you can see yourself in a book, you're more likely to read it.
Yeah. It's got to be relatable, or sometimes it takes you away from your life and what's going on. Mm-hmm. And that's the beauty of books. It can be something that you want to learn about, or something that you want to just enjoy, or something you want to switch off from. Yeah. And it can take you away. I do think one thing is reading is a skill. Mm-hmm. And reading for pleasure is a skill.
Definitely.
Some people pick up skills, naturally, don't they? And so there'll be people out there that just picked up a book and loved it, and then ever since then they've been a reader. Now, for me, reading was a really tough skill to learn.
Yeah,
I could never pick up a book when I was like a young boy and just enjoy it. I would love people reading to me, maybe a teacher or a parent reading to me, but as far as I was concerned, I couldn't just get into a book. Mm-hmm. And I still struggle now to get past that first maybe chapter, and once I'm there, it just flows.
Yeah.
You almost have to enter that flow state of reading. Mm-hmm. Some people can get there quicker than others, but I do think that's probably where a lot of people, young boys, give up.
Yeah.
Young boys, especially more than girls, maybe would give up on things that are difficult a lot quicker. And when things are tough, it's easy to jack it in and say, I'm not doing that then. When you were, you know that picture where someone's digging in a cave and the gold's there and they give up, it's like, you were just there. Just keep reading. But in relation to that, that's one thing that I think school tries to do in its best interest. It's let's force these kids to read because eventually it'll all click.
Yeah.
But it can go too far into like a nagging, you need to read at this time and this is when we read, you need to read for your homework, this is what you do. It can push people away.
And then again it comes back to that association. What do you associate reading with? Do you associate with school? Do you associate with punishment? Do you associate with difficulty? Or do you associate with relaxing and escaping and learning and allowing your imagination to flow? So it's to me, it is about association. And you mentioned there about it being difficult to get into the flow. I do think that comes down to the book. You know, often it comes down to the book and the type of reader, and trying to marry them up a little bit. There's a lot of good intention with regards to reading initiatives, but then you maybe look at the book that they're trying to read, and it might be The Great Gatsby or Jekyll and Hyde. Well, you're not going to turn a non-reader into a reader with a book that's as complex as that. You might need something that's a little bit more closer to home, shorter, more engaging on a contemporary level, maybe. One of the things about my first series of books, the Granville series, was the feedback from young lads was that they could see themselves in there because the main character grew up in challenging home life, difficult community where there was drugs and crime and poverty, and it felt real, and it felt like it represented some things that they might have experienced. And one thing I'll never forget this. There was a pupil referral unit who bought my first book as a class novel. So they bought about 12 copies, and they had these young lads who didn't read, and they had it as a class novel. And I went in, and they were about 3/4 of the way through it, and I went in to talk to them, and they had loads of questions, and there was one lad that was just like, can I just say thank you? And I was like, yeah, why? And he's like, because you didn't make the drug users monsters. And I was like, wow. Go on. And he went, everything we read or everything we watch or everything we listen to, anyone who takes drugs is a monster. They're the villain. They're the evil person. And in your books, they're not. It feels like it's part of, a difficult life. And that just feels a little bit more relatable. And I was thinking, I bet you've got someone in your family that and he knew that I did because I'd spoken about, where the inspiration for the book came from. If I was 15 and I read that and the older brother was a drug user, I'd be like, oh, whoa, this makes sense. I'm not on my own, or, this actually, I'd feel less isolated, I feel less worried, feel less anxious about it. And I feel like that's what that young lad was trying to say to me. It was, you've created characters that feel real to us, and they're not caricatures.
That's so special, because when someone gives you advice, sometimes you don't want to hear advice. Like, you don't want someone telling you about your circumstances and how it's all going to be better. But if you can read that yourself in a book, there's no one telling you. You don't have to listen and follow along and take part in the conversation. You can just get lost in this book, but you're actually being seen, being heard. It's like someone giving you a hug through words. That's huge,
Yeah, it's big, and it's not from any place of authority. It's just a story within a book.
Yeah, but it's...
And that's just one example of supporting young people to try and find a story that connects with them. And my books might be, completely irrelevant to some young people, and that's fine. But there will be some books out there where young people connect to the story and the characters and the situations and the circumstances that they're living in. And I feel like that's a really useful way to try and hook younger people into reading, finding books where they can see themselves in the story. As opposed to, and this is not me being critical of the classics at all, there's a massive place for them. But if there's a reluctant reader, you're more chance if you can find a book where they can see themselves in there than you are of trying to get them to read Frankenstein.
Definitely.
Frankenstein should be an aspiration for them further down the line, but maybe here and now it's something that they're going to enjoy and find that flow state with, where they are reading and it's just flowing and it is the bit of absorbing it, and it's not overly complex. It's not about challenging them too greatly, in terms of their vocabulary and being able
even
to
just giving them a test about the book that you've read. It's like a bit of the high pressure to just turn these kids away, And you're right, everything you said. There's one other kind of big topic, which is, at the start we said, you said that it's never really changed. Boys and some girls have always kind of just not been, they've been against reading. Nowadays, because you've got TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, whatever it is, gaming, if you could put a book in front of a child and a Nintendo Switch, it's like, okay, well, which are they going to choose? And 99% of children would probably pick that Nintendo Switch. But I think if the child chose the book, they'd be able to concentrate on that book for a lot longer than that Nintendo Switch. Like, it's almost like it doesn't look as good. It's almost like, don't judge a book by its cover. Get into
it's not
the
as
book.
glamorous, is it?
Yeah.
And you don't get the instant gratification from reading. You might get that little spark of, imagination. You might relax a little bit. You might be able to switch off. In terms of the story, you're in it for the long haul. Whereas maybe you get a little bit more of an instant dopamine hit when you scroll through TikTok, or you have a little blast on Call of Duty or whatever. And I think one of the issues maybe sometimes with digital kind of means and fun is that we pit them against each other when there's room for both. I always say to young people, you don't even have to tell anyone. If you start reading, you don't tell anyone. Get a book from a charity shop, get a book from a library, get it on your bedside table, and then when you've finished with your Snapchat and your TikTok notifications, take 10 minutes to read. It doesn't have to replace anything. Just 10 minutes every night before bed. You'll sleep better. And I know I often joke and say, I'll come back and eat my hat in a year if you've not benefited. And it's not about replacing these kind of digital sources of fun. It's about where can reading fit alongside, because there is a place for both. And actually, what a great way to practice that other part of our brain where we might require a little bit of patience and perseverance. What a great way to practice by reading a book whilst getting your kicks playing your Xbox or on TikTok or whatever. Still getting that, but actually to read a book as well. It enables you to build skills that maybe aren't being promoted as much with today's kind of instant kind of,
the instant
means of fun.
gratification of it. I think that's something adults struggle with, is having the time to read if you don't prioritise it, because you're more likely to pick up your phone than a book, even if it's just on the shelf. But I read at night before bed, 10 minutes, but it turns into 20, and then before you know it, I'm got one eye open, trying to stay awake to finish the book.
To the end of the chapter.
But unless you prioritise this time somewhere in the day to read, you're gonna be distracted, because we live in a world now where there's so many distractions, most of them digital, but the importance of reading is still vital, probably more than ever, like you say.
Just trying to find those little moments to develop our skills where maybe we don't need to all that often. You think about AI. AI can do pretty much, lots of functional things for us. At what cost, though? At what cost? And I think we've had conversations off air about some of the the issues around AI. But to me, it's about making it simple and accessible and worth it. Reading isn't something you're doing to please your teachers or your parents or whoever you live with. Reading's something you can do to benefit yourself. And if we can just get young men to just sort of maybe open, and young women, but I'm just mindful of the podcast, obviously, and the majority of lads that we work with at Rosscon, the majority of the young lads who are there doing the construction and whatnot, they don't read, do they? So, but if we could just maybe reframe what reading is and what it can offer and what it can represent, and the fact that it doesn't change your personality, it doesn't change your reputation and your social credibility, because nobody needs to know.
That's it.
If we could just reframe that slightly and work with young men on small steps to re-engage with things like reading and creativity, and build the confidence so that they feel that it's worth it, that they're worth it, actually, that they're worth it, they're worth that little bit of effort. Because with a little bit of effort, you can get really, really big outcomes further down the line. But it is about them understanding that they are worth it, and not just pushing it away because I'm not pushed that way because I've never been any good at school. completely unrelated. I was jogging down the prom last night, and 2 young lads flagged me over. They were like that. So I've gone over and they were like, "Can you help us?" It's like, "Yeah, this old lady's fallen over. I've rang the ambulance and I've rang the police, but she's getting a little bit aggressive." Now, I don't know what her story was. She was quite aggressive. So I stopped and obviously talked to the lads. And because we were waiting for the police and the ambulance, and another runner stopped, she was trying to talk to the lady as well. I'm going to guess she'd had a bad day. Let's just put it like that. But the lads, I think one was like 19 and his little brother was 12, and they were cycling to go to St Anne's. Lovely lads. So I just started a conversation, like, "What school did you go to?" And then the older lad said, "Oh, I went to this school, but I was kicked out." So I was like, "Well, oh, right, oh." And then I went, what school do you go to? What school do you go to? And his younger brother said, "I go to this school. I've been moved from another school, and I get in trouble quite a lot." So I thought it was really interesting that they started the conversation with letting me know that, instead of just, I didn't ask what their, kind of behavioural history was. And I found it really, really interesting that they'd had negative experiences of school, yet they'd stopped to help an old lady. And he was like, "I'm not," because she was telling us where to get to, and this lad was like, "I'm not leaving you, love. I'm staying with you until you get help." And it was really moving. And actually, I got to the point where I kind of sussed that the lady was all right. So I stopped concerning myself with the lady. I was more bothered about the 2 boys, and I thought, I've got an opportunity here to just give them a little bit of a boost. I said, "You know what, lads? You've done absolutely brilliant. You've done brilliant. And I don't care what your schools have said about you. You're good lads. I can tell. I meet a lot of people. You're good lads." And I thought, they've been kicked out of schools. They might have been an absolute nightmare at school, but underneath it, there's lads that are willing to stop and try and help somebody in need. And not only that, when they were getting shouted at by the lady and she wasn't very nice, they stuck to the guns. And to me, it's about focusing on that side of these young men that we spend a lot of time with, just unearthing that bit that maybe hasn't been criticised as much, and it's about pulling that stuff up and pulling that stuff to the surface. And reading is one of those things. It's one of those things that they did once upon a time, they might find difficult, but they've just dismissed now because they've put it in a bag with school, academics, doing well, high achievers, and they're not them. But there's so much more to people than that, as we well know.
And that is today we're talking about reading, but the stories of people's paths in life, what they've been through, what they've been told, it's all stories, and it's why we wanted you to be the first guest. Your work is a lot about, books and poetry, but it's about storytelling and confidence and growth and motivation and anything that kind of creates a story for someone's life.
Yeah.
And them lads, like you said in that story, probably think they're not good lads. Yeah. They've been kicked out. I'm not.
They couldn't wait to tell me.
Exactly.
It's like they almost had to buffer that I went to this school, but I got kicked out. It's almost like managing my expectations of it.
And then plot twist, you're helping an old lady in the middle of the street. She's kicking off at you, and you still got the empathy and the kindness to
me
help.
And the lady who stopped did not have as much patience as those 2 boys. And the 12-year-old was a little bit shaken up by it, and that's why the older one stopped us, because he was getting a bit worried about his brother. The older one maintained composure, politeness, respect. I was looking at the lady thinking, because she was calling us all sorts of names, this older lady. I was looking at the other runner who starts to say, "Crikey, some people you can't help." This lad, he maintained that throughout. Never let it drop once. And I just thought, how many times have you been told that you're a cracking lad, that you've got a heart of gold, that you're capable of, helping people? And sometimes those negative messages, they leave a lasting impression on our young people.
They shape who you are.
And I know we're talking about reading, and reading is a big part of that because it's the subliminal messages of what reading represents, which is high achievers. And actually, reading's for everyone. Reading should be for everyone. Whether you are an amazing reader that can sit there and read The Count of Monte Cristo, or whether you are somebody that needs to kind of simplify those books, and maybe you read a Goosebumps, or you read, some of the series that are maybe for a slightly younger age range, but does it matter?
Exactly.
Does it matter?
And even go down the route of, listen, fiction books are brilliant. They take you away. They can help your imagination, your creativity, whatever it may be. But there's lads I teach at Rosscon who write their own raps. They read rap lyrics all day from different artists to get inspiration, and that is, in a sense, reading. Some of the lyrics that rappers these days have are, yeah, there's some that are about kind of guns and violence,
Yeah.
right? But a lot of them have these innuendos and these similes and metaphors.
Massive play on words, yeah.
Yeah, and
lots of cultural references,
exactly.
all sorts of stuff.
But yet at school, because we're learning Shakespeare, it doesn't necessarily resonate with these young people. Some of them, and Shakespeare is definitely, you know, it's beneficial, but in today's world, it's not applicable to our life.
I think, again, going back to that point I made before about the digital versus the reading, and we often kind of go down this conversation of either or, and I know you'll agree because we've spoke about it before, there's space for the classics, but we also need some sort of contemporary edge to literature across the board, in my opinion, and most teachers I speak to agree. You get some that are really creative and maybe find a little bit of a space in their kind of teaching week to bring in maybe a little bit of rap to help with poetry and stuff, but they're under such pressure in really tight kind of time frames to deliver a curriculum that is so rigid often that their instinct to want to connect and teach and discuss and explore is really, really restricted.
Massively.
And that builds stress in all corners of a school, doesn't it? And it's not an easy task because it's not just a school thing. Again, going back to kind of complex and all that, and I feel like I keep kind of going back to that. But the issue of reading is not a school thing. You know, it's a much broader thing than that, in my opinion. It's a societal thing, and it's these kind of factors that all play against each other, or kind of can't quite come together in a with synergy that means that we end up with kind of challenging circumstances with, you know, young men, young women, you know, teenagers as a whole, you know, whether that's behaviour, whether it's online content, whether it's, you know, disrespectful kind of comments, whether it's, you know, a lack of engagement in education, you know, whatever it is, we end up with this kind of spillage into a school, and then it's looked at sometimes just through a school lens. Think about, if you ask most people a question about reading, most people would look to schools for the answer. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think it's about, you know, young people across the board, about instilling and building a sense of confidence, purpose, identity, and, you know, trying to reintroduce and reframe what reading can represent in terms of an opportunity for ourselves.
Yeah. Do you know, it's easy to say, kind of to bring it to a close, it's easy to say for us, you know, so reading's so important and just make sure you read. And as a young person, if we were to tell them that, some of them would probably listen and take it on board, and a lot of them would say, yeah, whatever, like, I'm going to go and play Xbox. But what I hope is the graph of what's happened to me is reading. I'm going to be a teenager now and I don't care about reading. But as I get into my early adult life, I'll find books that are about something I'm interested in or resonate with me. And, you know, you do a lot of work in schools with your books and poetry and storytelling, and that resonates with the lads you've worked with at Rosscon. Like, love you, because you connect with them in such a positive way through this, like, almost like you get there and you say, I get you, like, I know what it's like, I'll share my story with you and hope that you'll let me into some of yours. And they do, and they love it, and that's great. And like, going into schools and motivating young people to read is needed, but the graph of reading for pleasure probably will always look like spike, drop off, back to a nice spike.
And I think there's a lot of things that teenagers move away from naturally because of adolescence, because of puberty, and, you know, our innate kind of sense of wanting to find independence away from authority figures, maybe kicking back a little bit. And reading might just be one of those things that does suffer the consequences, gets stuck in the middle a little bit and kind of feels the wrath of teenage rebellion. But like you say, I think sometimes it is about motivating young people to read, but it's about, well, why should I listen to you? And I think one of the things that I'm lucky enough to be able to say is, because I did what you did, and when I rediscovered reading, I thought, oh, I wish I'd have read. I wish I'd have read. Not because it would have solved my problems, but because it probably would have helped me understand them a little bit more. And I would have got a head start. And, you know, thankfully, it came when it came. And it built towards, you know, where I'm at the minute. But there is a little bit of letting them into your story so that they will let you into theirs. It's such a nuanced thing working with young people, isn't it? As you know, teachers have such a hard job because you've got 30 individuals in a room, 25, 30 individuals in a room with individual stories, individual mornings that they've had, individual learning styles, individual interests, individual family dynamics. And then you're putting them in a room and you're expected to teach them and inspire them, and that is a tough job. That is a really tough job. And that, you know, I doff my cap to teachers out there that are working really, really hard to try and engage young people in a curriculum that is actually quite tricky sometimes. Often feels outdated in some respects, but yet you get creative teachers that turn up every day and try and make the classroom somewhere that young people can learn in and feel safe. And that's a great thing. Hopefully we can continue to build on that, and hopefully, you know, the curriculum eases off a little bit and allows teachers a bit of breathing time to be the teacher that they set out to be. And through that, hopefully, teachers will connect with young people, maybe learn a little bit about them, and young people will learn a little bit more about kind of who they've got in their life around them, and that to me is where you move forward. And reading can be one of those places that some young people might discover through that sense of connection. But as I said before, it's complex. There's lots and lots of things that can impact it. Some people just don't like reading. Some people can't read. You know, some people can't retain information. Everybody's individual. But I think there's a massive amount of young people out there that would benefit from reading a book for 10 minutes before bed. They maybe just can't see it yet.
Yeah, it's that skill that they just need to develop. And if they've tried, maybe it's not not their thing, and that is fine.
That's okay. That's cool. Yeah, but I'd hate to think as if there's a young person out there that is holding themselves back from reading because of the way it might appear to their peers, or their masculinity, or their kind of social standing. I'd hate to think that somebody's not reading because of that. And that might be conscious or subconscious, but I'd hate to think that that's getting in the way of someone discovering the joys of reading.
You don't know how many future inventors or artists or rappers or, you know, authors that could be if they just were to get the right book. It's, you know, that's why people say like books are magical, books are amazing. It's, you understand the vitalness, the priority of books and what they can do for you. But listen, thanks so much for having this conversation.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure. You know, I love chatting to you, Connor.
Yeah, I'm glad we managed to stay on topic.
Yeah, we did. You know, we do usually go off on a tangent, don't we? But it is hard when you work with young people. There's tangents to be travelled. You know, and as we know, sometimes they want to travel those tangents.
And it's the world's complex, you know, and every topic has its own complexities. But thanks for having this conversation.
Privilege.
It's a conversation that was needed.